Good morning, everybody. We got a full house here. It's great to be with y'all. Sorry for the couple of seconds of delay. They told me to wait for my music, so I did. First of all, let me start off by thanking you, Grant, for the introduction, but most importantly for the great work that you're doing as part of the Heinz Endowments efforts to boost opportunity and prosperity here in Pittsburgh and the region. Let's give Grant and the Heinz Endowments a big round of applause for everything that they're doing. I also want to thank Grant for getting it right. I have a twin brother. His name is Julián Castro. Have any of y'all ever seen my brother on CNN or MSNBC? I tell him that I see him on CNN or MSNBC more often than I do in real life these days. He's on the House Intelligence Committee, so you can imagine that he's been pretty busy. The thing is that my brother habitually goes around telling people that the way to tell us apart is that I'm a minute uglier than he is. When I was in Washington, I used to tell people that the real way to tell us apart was that we both lived in Washington, but he was in Congress, so I was the only one who actually worked in Washington, D.C. He didn't like that joke very much. I want to thank, of course, the Heinz Endowments, all of the folks who helped put this P4 conference together, and then also extend a big thanks to your mayor, Bill Peduto, whom I had the opportunity to speak with last night, and I've known of his good work and the leadership that he's offering to Pittsburgh, which I think has been fantastic. So I'm excited to be with you all today for several reasons. Number one, it's always fantastic to be in this city. Pittsburgh has played a tremendous role in shaping the trajectory of our country throughout its history. It's playing a big role now, and I'm convinced that it's going to play an even bigger role in the future. When I think about Pittsburgh, I think of a place that is steeped in 21st century industries, is making some good investments in brain power and learning, is attractive more and more to young people, and is becoming more and more competitive against other cities in the United States and around the world. And I know that the folks around this room, in your different capacities, whether you're in the business community, in the nonprofit community, or in the public sector, that y'all play a big role in that and that you will in the future. So thank you for that. Y'all have created a truly unique and special community here in Pittsburgh. I also like Pittsburgh because I don't care for the Dallas Cowboys. And wait, don't clap too quickly though. My favorite team is the Philadelphia Eagles. So I hear some claps out there. But more seriously, I'm happy to be here because the focus of this conference goes right to the heart of why I went into public service in the first place. My brother Julián and I grew up on the west side of San Antonio with my mother and my grandmother. And when I went away to college, we'd gone to the public schools of San Antonio, hardly ever been outside of the city. When I went away to Stanford, it was the first time that I could see my own community very clearly through an outsider's eyes. And some of the things I saw, I liked. For instance, I realized how much San Antonio is a wonderful place to raise a family. How much San Antonio, and I bet Pittsburgh is like this, still had this sense of community to it. And by that I mean that if two people passed each other on the sidewalk downtown, they would still look each other in the eye. That's harder than it seems, right? Y'all have been to cities here or around the world where there's a guardedness, a disconnect between people. They're almost as though they're afraid to let somebody else on the street into their life. It's hard to keep as cities get bigger. I also saw some things that I didn't like. In the Bay Area of San Francisco, I saw in the early 90s a place that had higher education levels, higher income levels, was more entrepreneurial, more ready for the future than the city that I'd come from. And my interest in going into politics and public service was really, how do you create the best of both worlds? A city that is welcoming and has this sense of community, but also creates opportunity well, creates well-educated folks that are able to get jobs with good incomes and provide for their families, and is ready for the future, is innovative, is entrepreneurial. And that's why I went in to public service right after I got out of law school, and eventually, as Grant said, became mayor. But the third reason that I'm excited to be here is because this conversation is happening in a moment where arguably cities have not been more important, or they're more important than they ever have been in our nation's history. It is very clear that today, with the federal government and many state governments retrenching from support on things like education, healthcare, social services, housing, that local communities, places where people of different backgrounds, different perspectives, different parties often, roll their sleeves up in the spirit of doing something for the community that they all live in, improving it, that's where the action is today. And over the last few years, whether the issue has been raising the minimum wage, expanding equality to the LGBTQ community, or working toward the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, it hasn't always been the federal government or the state government that has been at the lead. It's been local governments, including Pittsburgh. So it's exciting to have this conversation about possibilities and how cities can get it right in this moment where you can make a contribution to the forward progress, sure, of Pittsburgh and the region, but also help set an example for other communities, big and small, that are suddenly realizing how much of a responsibility they have to pick up some of the mantle of leadership and to move people forward because they have to. They don't have a choice. And during my time at HUD, I visited 100 different communities in 39 states over 2.5 years. So you can imagine that I had a lot of opportunity to see the good and the bad and what was working and what wasn't, to get a sense of communities that are on the ball and those that sometimes, unfortunately, are standing in place. Today, we hear a lot about the future of communities. Some of y'all may have seen a couple of days ago that the American News reported on basically a social credit score that China is adopting. Did any of y'all read that or see that on the news? Right? It works like a credit score, except they score you as a citizen as to whether you pay your taxes on time or do other things that are in keeping with the government's beliefs about how you should behave as a citizen. I think for Americans, that absolutely frightens us, and I think it should. But it was one more component that created some wonder about what kind of world are we and other nations headed into. More commonly, you hear things about, for instance, some things that are going to happen in the near future, like driverless cars, which I think are being piloted here, partly in Pittsburgh. You hear about drone deliveries and have images in your head about one day, are we going to essentially look out of our window and instead of just the trees and the sky, maybe an airplane going by, sometimes you're going to see all of these little drones delivering whatever somebody ordered from Amazon, right? When we talk about the future, oftentimes it's both exciting and also sometimes unnerving. But as policymakers, or those who advise policymakers or fund policymakers or challenge policymakers or at least hold those policymakers to account, the real question is, during these uncertain times and as we look forward with excitement to some of that future and with concern about other parts of it, what are the common elements that cities need to pursue to ensure that they can make policy that will stand the test of time, will increase prosperity, will reduce inequality, and enhance opportunity in the long run? And as a former policymaker myself, I wanted to come and just briefly offer a few thoughts. Number one, always connect the dots. Always connect the dots. I remember being a 27-year-old city council member and going to a budget meeting in one of the neighborhoods that I represented. And after the meeting, this little neighborhood meeting we had with folks, there was a woman who was middle-aged who came up to me, and she asked me if I would make sure that in the next budget there was some money that was put into sidewalks for the street that her mom lived on. Her mother was an elderly woman whose doctor had just diagnosed her recently with diabetes. And she said that the doctor recommended that she walk to improve her circulation. But the woman told me that her mother couldn't walk in her neighborhood because there were no sidewalks. She couldn't walk safely, and because packs of dogs had also taken over the neighborhood. And to me, at that age of 27, as a young policymaker, it was the first time that the light went on in my head in a very real way about the connections between different elements of policy that we do. And that really, it is not enough to just focus on infrastructure investment, or transportation, or education, or housing, or economic development, or the environment alone. That all of those things are connected. In this woman's case, it made a difference to her health and her safety as to whether we put those sidewalks, that basic, most basic form of infrastructure that cities do, had ramifications across the silos that we often create in policymaking. And so I'm convinced that one of the things that the best cities do, the most effective cities, is that they get this right. They don't just see each of those policy areas, they actually connect those dots together. They do that in exciting ways, including some of the work that's going on here with the Choice Neighborhood Project to connect those dots. Secondly, always align your interests. You know, in a community like Pittsburgh, a big city, there are so many people that are doing a lot of great work. The foundations know that maybe better than anybody because they get pitched by a lot of nonprofits and even local governments and individuals about fantastic, impactful work that is happening. If I could wave a magic wand and have every city in the United States do one thing tomorrow, it would be for the mayor and the county supervisor and the housing director, housing authority director, and the community college executive, and the superintendent of the school district, and the transit authority director, and the utilities director, and the leading nonprofits, and citizens from the community to get together in one room with maps in front of them of the most distressed neighborhoods in their area, and to mark out the different investments and projects that they have going on and things that are being funded and things that are being planned in those areas, and to first get a look at both the overlap and the gaps that exist. Now, you might think that this kind of thing happens all the time. But those of y'all who have done this kind of work know that actually it doesn't. Sometimes when we have effective place-based work, that happens on a limited basis. But what a revelation it can be to understand how the dots are connected, how interests are aligned or not aligned, and then to plan effectively and to create goals for lifting up the people who live in those neighborhoods. And by doing that, lift up the entire community. Thirdly, make policy based on how people live now and how they're going to live in the future, and not how they lived yesterday. You know, as you can imagine, when I was Secretary of HUD, I had the chance to visit with a lot of folks in a lot of different forms of housing. We'd visit folks who lived in public housing, folks who were voucher holders and lived in private homes on the market, people who lived in co-ops, folks who lived in senior citizen housing, what we called Section 202, people with disabilities who lived in HUD housing. One of the most memorable visits that I ever made was to a housing community that the Cleveland Housing Authority had created for grandparents who were raising their children as their own. You know that there are almost 3 million grandparents in the United States today that are raising their grandchildren as though they were their own kids. And yet, if you think about it, the way that we've set up our public housing and entire system is based around the idea of a parent that has children or a senior citizen that largely lives alone. This was the first time that I had actually seen a housing authority that got it, that understood that this is the new reality of how people were living in the 21st century. And that idea is portable. How do you take that and apply that to the different types of policy that we make to keep up and understand the changes that we ought to make, and ultimately provide a better quality of life for the folks that we're trying to serve? That's what I took away from the conversations that I had with those grandparents that were so happy that now they didn't have to worry about having a problem with the manager because there were kids that were playing around in their apartment and making too much noise for the neighbor. All of the problems that they would have when they were living in a traditional housing community that didn't accept that children would be around in any number. So always look for that. And fourthly, there is no substitute for thinking beyond the bounds of the city. Think and act regionally. This is harder than it sounds. I know that as a former mayor, because let me tell you, as a mayor, when somebody said, oh, you know, you should do this regional effort, you should make a push with the mayor of whatever suburb was outside of the city, oftentimes the first thing that you think about as a mayor is you think about it in a competitive way. You think about that cities are often fighting for economic development projects. You know, what are we going to offer versus what are they going to offer? Or who's going to actually have the plant or the office that's located here? Cities have been oftentimes trained to be competitive instead of collaborative. But the scale and the responsibility of what we're dealing with for local communities is so big now that the most successful ones are going to be those that can get past that and work with the communities around them. The big city on equal terms with the communities around it to thrive. Let me give you a good example from my old neck of the woods, which was housing. What I could see very clearly, and many others have written about, was that we had this suburbanization of poverty, that more and more suburbs were experiencing homelessness, folks that were doubling up in their communities that didn't have a place that they could afford, that were now living in these suburban communities and not in the big city. And yet, from what I could tell, the vast majority of suburbs didn't want to deal with affordable housing. That was the big city's problem. And it's not because the folks on there were necessarily bad people, the folks on these suburban city councils. A lot of times it's because the suburb had not ever thought of itself as having those needs. And only recently, in real numbers, had to grapple with that kind of policy. So oftentimes, in this relationship, the big city can help the suburbs as much as the suburbs help the big city. to see what kind of policy making and investments need to be made for overall prosperity. And then finally, invest in brain power. Brain power is the new currency of success in the 21st century global economy. Those communities that cultivate it will be the ones that thrive, and those that don't are going to fall behind. A few weeks ago, I was in San Francisco, and you know those elevators those fancy elevators that they have a TV screen? It looks like you're watching HLN or CNN, but it's not really that. It's like cheap news. I don't know what company does it. Anyway, on the crawl of the elevator screen, it said that it was Republic Day in India. And I remembered that 5 years earlier, in January of 2013, I was in Chennai, India, the sister city of San Antonio, because I was mayor of San Antonio, making my first visit to India. And while we were watching the Republic Day ceremonies, one of the government officials that I was with told me that there were 400 different engineering programs in the state of Tamil Nadu alone. In this 21st century, the United States is engaged in this unprecedented competition for jobs and investment and opportunity, with nations around the world that are rising, that are producing young people with enormous talent, with the intelligence and the ambition and the creativity to spark the ideas and the companies and the products that are going to drive prosperity in the 21st century. And so in this world, the United States as a nation doesn't have a single person to waste. We need everybody's talent. And if you want to be competitive as a community, it means investing in pre-K. It means investing in college opportunity. It means investing in skills building and certification so that folks can get jobs along the opportunity spectrum. And the good news is that I know that Pittsburgh in many ways is a good model for this. And the linkages that have been made between the universities and the local education community and some of the investments that have been made, I think, hold out great hope. My hope is that in the years to come, that the legislature will invest even more in education and help ensure that Pittsburgh and other communities in Pennsylvania can thrive even more. But my hope for y'all today is that this P4 conference is an opportunity to hear some great ideas, to network, to learn, to contribute, but also hopefully to reflect on why you're here and why you have that spark of passion for your community. Because I bet, like me, you feel like in life you have been blessed with tremendous opportunity, and that through your efforts, whether in the private sector, nonprofit, or public sector, that you can help make that opportunity possible for so many other folks in Pittsburgh and beyond. And if we all do that, working together, community by community, despite all the negativism that we hear these days, I'm convinced that we can create prosperity in the United States and a 21st century that all of us can be proud of. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.